All right, guys. So I have Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois together in one video for you guys. I'm going to try to keep it as short as I possibly can, but there's a lot to cover. Mainly because they wrote in, W.B. Du Bois wrote in kind of opposition or a break from Booker T. Washington. So that's why I have them kind of compared with each other here. And you're going to do an assignment, a comparison assignment with me in a second. So I really want you to pay attention about how these two works really kind of fit together. So um, Booker T. Washington, he is one of the seminal African-American writers. He was born a slave, was freed during the Emancipation Proclamation, lived through the Civil War, and Up from Slavery is a very famous work, and you've probably may have read it before. But the thing about his writing style versus Du Bois is that Booker T. Washington was working within a confined system. So he was a very humble man, a very hardworking man. You read his biography. He not only just came from slavery, but he became educated as a teacher, and he really found value in the labor of the individual. And he felt in particular that African American society should be judged by the work of the individual rather than particular policies, because if you think about the area he was working in, we're working on Reconstruction era politics. There's a lot that he had to, a system that was constrained, that he had to work within. So he couldn't just outright call for equal rights. He couldn't call for, he called for the humane treatment of African Americans, but he couldn't just outright call for civil rights and equal rights because of the very difficult political situation that African Americans were navigating post Civil War. So as you know, he famously founded the Tuskegee School and Tuskegee Institute, and famously they built it brick by brick by brick together, him and his students. And he also did the Atlantic Compromise, and this is where Du Bois really broke from him. So the Atlantic Compromise basically called for human rights and equal rights for African Americans, but within a sort of disenfranchised system. So he basically, again, was working with the system that he had. And it was, it was praised by African Americans and whites alike for its sort of the policies that it put forth. And he was really just a celebrated, immaculate figure almost. He was, as I said, a very humble man. So as you read Up from Slavery, I know it's a bit of a long selection, but I wanted you to really understand his writing style, his tone, and compare that to Du Bois. So you'll notice that he describes things with sort of humility and a very cheeky understanding that what he's doing is he knows exactly what he's doing. He's putting out these realities of life of slaves and life of African Americans under slavery, but without saying, look at what these atrocities and all these things that they did to us. He's just putting them forward as facts, saying, well, isn't this just crazy? And what he's doing is he's trying to get his audience to see how ridiculous the treatment of African Americans was, even though he was treated fairly well. But he also has this really interesting dichotomy where he talks about the balance of the relationship between white society and African American slaves pre and during and post the Emancipation Proclamation. So we get a really interesting view of the Civil War here, which is why I also want you guys to really read this to kind of see a reality of the Civil War perspective we don't often get. So, for example, if you look at page 676-ish to 677, he talks about the reality of being a child slave. And he says, ironically, I don't remember ever being, having a pastime or a time to play, because it wasn't a reality for a slave child. You didn't get to do that. He says, my time was spent doing this or going with the horse down the road with the corn. And then when the corn fell off, I would, be lost and I would be scared because I heard all these horrible things about, what, Yankee soldiers would do, or not Yankees, but what our soldiers would do in the woods to lost little boys that they found, and all these, he cut off their ears and horrible things. But he says them very matter of fact, and he just says them from the view of, this is what I was like as a child, and this is why I didn't have an understanding of what it was to play, because I didn't. And he doesn't put blame on society, but it's very clear that this is an unjust system. So he's using a sort of peaceful protest in a sense, along the lines of MLK, where he's showing this is why this is unjust, because it just is. He's not blustering, he's not angry, he's not railing against the horrible the people that did these things. He's saying this was a problem with the way society was structured. Um, so he says, he talks about the sort of hope that African Americans had for what Lincoln might be doing, and how his mother, prayed every night for this to happen. And then about 678, he goes into how slave society often worked as its own culture within itself. So he said that quite often the slaves were smart. They would, I mean, they were very. He's showing how that they were very smart. They're not ignorant. They're not, maybe they were illiterate, but it's because of an unjust system. And he's saying we were smart. We had the brains. We just didn't have the facilities to help us. So he shows how the slaves quite often knew the news of the battles and the wars before the people, the masters in the homestead and people on the plantations. And they had this wonderful sort of built-in communication network with each other. So they really had this amazing society that was existing, where people thought they were subhuman and that they weren't really a society of people. They didn't deserve to be treated as humans. And so that's what he's really showing us there. And he shows us this moment on 678 where he talks about the ginger cakes, where he talks about the little girls, and he would see the little girls, the master's girls, eating these ginger cakes. And he could imagine no greater, treat that he could have than these ginger cakes. And at one point he talks about how there's something that he could never feel a greater joy or a greater pleasure in the world. He could never imagine a greater pleasure in the world than education. Because he would he would walk the master's girls to school, and he would see them all in the schoolhouse, little boys and girls, and he says, I could never imagine anything as wonderful as getting to read and learn. And this is very purposeful, because he goes on to promote not only the education for African Americans and for ex-slaves, but the training of them in labors, in specific labors, where they can go out and be teachers and laborers and promote that for other people. So he's really doing this on purpose, to show that this starts at a young age, and that African American slaves, ex-slaves, whatever, are just as deserving of education as their white counterparts. So again, we go into this very interesting moment where he talks about these slave songs, and the songs of how they would lie and say that when they talked about freedom, they were talking about freedom from the corporal body, from the life, and they meant the afterworld. But they said as freedom approached, as they knew they were going to be emancipated, they threw off the mask, he says, and they told, they were honest and said, no, it means freedom of the body in this life, freedom of myself as a free man. And so he, at the very end of this, in 682, he talks about the moment of where they were emancipated. And it seems like a very uneventful moment. I mean, it's the guy comes, he says a little speech, he reads something, which he says, and I think that was the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was it. And he says, very importantly, he says, yes, my mother cried, and it was this wonderful moment. And importantly, the white family never, they weren't bitter. He says they were concerned, and they were surprised, and he says there was a deep interest and sadness, perhaps, but not bitterness. And so he's saying, we don't blame the people. The people aren't necessarily bad. Yes, there are very bad people in the system, but the system itself is to blame. And then he says there's the reality sets in, this great responsibility, what he calls, of being free. So this idea that they have to start deciding how to live and where to live and how to raise their children and make a vocation and set up churches, and all these different things have to be decided. And maybe that's part of the sadness, he thinks, on the part of his, the white people. So then if you flip over to Du Bois, Du Bois is very different. He took a far different approach. He broke with Washington, which was, almost like sacrilege at this point. Washington had been established as the holy grail of writers at this point, of African American writers and the African American experience. And he basically said, I'm not okay with what Washington proposed as a separate but unequal, what he calls separate but unequal. He says, we need equal rights. We need absolute equality with white people. And so the Souls of Black Folk is a very different tone. It is aggressive. It is a little bit angry. It is much more along the lines of something like Malcolm X. And so he says, he starts on 886, says, how does it feel to be a problem? And he says, that's what we are in the world to these white people. He says, we are a problem to them. And he says, he defines this idea of two-ness, which is really central to his argument. And what he says is we have two souls. He's over on 887, about in the middle. He says, we have two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body. So he says, we are expected to be two different things all the time. He says, I'm an outcast in society and a stranger in my own house. And I have, quote unquote, equality, but I don't actually have equality. He says, I have the right to vote, but I don't have equal, standing with these white men, even though I am intelligent, even though I am educated. And he was the first African American to receive his PhD from Harvard. So he is highly educated, went to Fisk, and he says, why is this the way society is? This is not okay. And he basically goes on 888, he says, the problem is that for us, we have to constantly have this war within ourselves. So we have to fight against these two ideals, and we can't fight that battle. That's not fair to us to have to fight that battle. We should be able to be content within ourselves, know that we are not a problem, quote unquote, a problem to society, is what he says. He has this very exclamatory and strong and sort of boisterous language. He's like, shout, O children, shout, you are free, for God has brought your liberty. He's mocking those same sort of songs and proclamations that Washington was celebrating with, his other freedmen. And he says, we have this new nation at the bottom of 88. He says, the new nation has arisen. We see that. We have this new nation that's come from the Civil War. Things are new and different and changed, and we have a new American ideal. But it has not found peace from its sins. The freedman has not yet found freedom in his promised land. So this land may be for you, but it's not designed for me. I don't get to have a stake in this land yet. And he says we have the rise of all of these things, and it's things that are very scary are going to last for the next 60, 70 years. He talks about the KKK, he talks about the carpetbaggers, the industries, this organization of industries that comes in, the Holocaust of war, these ghosts of war that are left over. He says, yes, you gave us the 15th Amendment, you gave us the right to vote, but it doesn't mean we're equal. And so he says, these votes did not enfranchise the freedman. And he says this is the ideal of book learning. So again, he comes back to the idea of education. He says book learning, education is a right for every human being, black, white, male, woman, whatever. And he says education is the only way we get this equal opportunity with the white people. And so he says, all of these issues that we have, poverty, unskilled labor, all these things that are coming, especially you're going to start seeing it during, early 1900s, it's all a result of this inequality of treatment between white and black society. And you're going to see this start coming into a head in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then particularly, of course, civil rights. And then he says, he doesn't hold back on blaming a lot of white society for these problems. So top of 890, he does the opposite of what Washington does. And he says, this is the red stain of bastardy which the 2 centuries of systematic legal defilement of Negro women has stamped upon his race. So he's saying, you have destroyed and raped and killed our people for 200 years, pre and post Civil War. And he's saying, this is not okay. He says this, he calls them the white adulterers, the slave masters who did this to these women and created these children and never let them have equal rights or equal society with their white brothers and sisters. So he basically says we are a disease and dying. We are, cried the dark host. We cannot write. Our voting is in vain. We need education. Why must we always cook and serve? So why are we always put below these people? Why can't we be leaders? Why can't we be educators? Why can't we be all these wonderful things? So it's a really interesting view of post-Civil War society heading towards turn of the century. And, he says very clearly on 891, there's a few things he calls for which are really going to come into play in the next 20, 30 years. And he says we need the training of the schools more than ever. We need education more than ever. And he says we need the power of the ballot. We need work, culture, and liberty, not in successively, not one and then another, but we need them all together and we need them all now. So he really has just this incredibly strong call for equality. So I wanted you guys to kind of see the two of those writings together. And now I'm going to have a short assignment for you to go kind of compare the two of them together. So go ahead and go to the assignment below. And if you have any questions about all this, let me know.